It began on one of those heavy June afternoons when the heat sits on a town like a weight, thick enough that even the birds seem to give up trying. June 14th, 2003, in the small Midwestern town of Maple Hollow, Illinois, the kind of place where everyone knew which truck belonged to which neighbor, two sisters stepped out into the sun without the slightest sense that their lives were nearing a fault line. Amber Dalton, 17, bright-eyed and restless for adulthood, had just been accepted into a community college graphic design program. She'd spent the morning doodling logo ideas into the margins of her notebook, while half listening to her mom tell her, not for the first time, to clean her room. Her younger sister, Kayla, 15, quieter, more careful with the world, trailed behind her, clutching a dog-eared fantasy novel she'd planned to trade for another at the mall bookstore. Their mom, Denise, stood in the doorway of their modest white bungalow on Cedar Lane, pretending not to watch them too closely. She handed Amber a 20, told her to grab something cold to drink, and said she'd start dinner around 6. Amber teased Kayla about her slow walking pace. Kayla flicked a harmless insult back. It was the kind of soft, ordinary family moment people never think to memorize. The girls climbed into their aging blue Chevy Cavalier, a car that rattled when turning left and smelled faintly of strawberry air freshener. The engine coughed, kicked, then settled. Amber backed out of the driveway, honking twice out of habit, her way of saying goodbye. "Be home before dark," Denise called, although they had already pulled away. It should have been a 10-minute drive, just a quick trip to Ridgeway Mall, the only enclosed mall within 30 miles. A smoothie, a couple school year essentials, maybe a new keychain. It was the kind of outing they'd done dozens of times. But by nightfall, that afternoon would carve itself into Maple Hollow's bones. Denise wasn't an anxious woman by nature, but as dusk slid across town and the streetlights flicked on, her movements grew smaller, tighter. She reheated the pot roast, she stood by the screen door, she kept glancing at the driveway as if expecting headlights to appear. By 9 o'clock, the quiet in the house had turned unnatural, the kind that folds itself around you, making your heart beat louder than it should. She called a couple of the girls' friends, then a couple more. No one had seen them, no one had heard from them. Both sisters' phones rang straight to voicemail. By 11:30, her hands were shaking. She called the police at 11:52 p.m., her voice thin, apologetic, like she was afraid of overreacting. The dispatcher assured her officers would patrol the area, suggested she'd try to get some rest. She didn't. She sat by the kitchen window until dawn. At sunrise, an officer responding to the missing persons report spotted something unusual near an abandoned Phillips 66 off Route 19, a place locals called the Old Pit Stop, a cracked lot with weeds tall enough to swallow an entire bumper. There, parked neatly at the far edge, was the blue Chevy Cavalier. Both doors locked, purses on the front passenger seat, Amber's driver's license out, Kayla's school ID tucked beside a half-finished soda. The keys were missing, but nothing looked broken or forced. No shattered glass, no scuff marks, no sign anyone had fought to stay.
If the car could talk, it would have whispered one terrifying thing. They got out willingly. Detectives from the Maple Hollow Police Department arrived that afternoon, most of them unprepared for anything more serious than shoplifting cases or Saturday night bar fights. They photographed the car, dusted for prints, searched the surrounding lots. Their search turned up nothing. The summer wind had already erased whatever tracks the ground might have held. Within 24 hours, the Daltons' missing person bulletin hit local news. The language was cautious, no evidence of foul play, and possibly staying with friends, but no one who knew the family believed that. Amber was responsible, grounded, committed to saving for her first laptop. Kayla was scheduled to attend a church retreat that weekend and had been excited about it for months. They didn't skip appointments. They didn't disappear. When investigators pulled Amber's phone records, something chilling surfaced. The last outgoing call had been at 2:41 p.m., around 20 minutes after they'd been seen entering the mall. A voicemail had landed on Denise's phone, one she hadn't noticed in the flurry of panic. Denise sat on the edge of her bed as she pressed play. "Mom, can you check if—" Static. A metallic clatter. Silence. She replayed it 12 times, hoping the ending would change. It didn't. That message became the first thread in a case that would eventually unravel the small-town world around it. As hours turned into days, volunteers swarmed the area, church members, high school classmates, exhausted neighbors. They combed ditches, wooded lots, drainage tunnels. Helicopters traced patterns over the cornfields. Every tip felt promising until it didn't. A pair of girls hitchhiking on I-57 turned out to be runaways from another county. A dark pickup some claimed had followed the sisters earlier that week belonged to a father picking up his son from practice. An anonymous rumor about Amber dating an older man evaporated under scrutiny. With each false lead, hope inflated, then caved in again. The mood in Maple Hollow shifted from solidarity to something quieter, rawer. Denise taped flyers to telephone poles until her fingers blistered. She slept in 3-hour increments. She sat on the porch with her eyes on the street long after midnight. Detective Mark Ellery, a seasoned officer with gray creeping into his beard, took the lead. He later described those first weeks as trying to hold on to smoke. Every clue dissolved as soon as he touched it. Except one. A maintenance worker reported seeing a white cargo van idling near the mall's back exit the same afternoon the girls vanished. No plate, no markings. Security cameras caught only a blur, just the ghost of a van pulling out a frame. It wasn't enough. Not yet. But it would be the first whisper of a truth that would take 22 years to surface. And when it did, it would reveal more than a disappearance. It would expose a secret that had been rotting quietly beneath Maple Hollow since the summer of 2003.
Each clue felt like stepping stones across a river, but halfway through, they always vanished underwater. By mid-July, weeks after the sisters were last seen, the case began sinking into the kind of silence detectives dread. No new evidence, no confirmed sightings. The FBI briefly reviewed the case and found no grounds for federal involvement. The momentum drained from the investigation until it stood still. Meanwhile, Denise Dalton refused to accept the stillness. Every morning she called Detective Ellery's office, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep. She asked the same questions in different ways, searching for a version of the truth that felt less unbearable. Every time, Ellery answered gently. Every time, his answer was the same. "We don't have anything yet, Denise. Not yet." Denise began printing her own flyers on an old inkjet printer. She stood outside grocery stores with stacks of them. She taped them to gas pumps, telephone poles, bus stops. Her hair grew grayer within weeks. Her shoulders stooped. Still, she walked miles each day through the warm Illinois air with her daughters' faces pressed against her chest. At night, she left the porch light on. Always. People in town began noticing, sometimes when they drove home late, sometimes when they left for early shifts, the Daltons' old porch lamp glowing stubbornly against the night. Some people said it became a symbol of hope. Others said it was a symbol of denial. But no one tried to talk her out of it. Not one person. Because deep down, the whole town felt the same weight. When two good girls vanish without a trace, something in the world shifts. Something dark stirs beneath the surface of ordinary life. And in Maple Hollow, that darkness was beginning to thicken. Detective Ellery stayed late most nights, poring over files with tired, red-rimmed eyes. He reviewed the CCTV footage frame by frame, replaying the grainy scene of Amber and Kayla laughing as they walked into Ridgeway Mall. At 2:17 p.m., Amber and Kayla were alive, carefree, unaware of the white van idling in the background. By 2:41 p.m., Amber's unfinished voicemail had been recorded. Somewhere in those 24 minutes, the Dalton sisters slipped into a corridor of time that offered no exits. Then the case stalled entirely. Summer turned into early fall. The first frost crept across lawns. Volunteers, once energized, grew exhausted. The media shifted focus to newer stories, and though Maple Hollow didn't forget the sisters, people spoke their names with a kind of cautious sadness, like saying them too loudly might summon something painful. In November, the community held a candlelight vigil outside the mall. Dozens stood with flickering lights cupped in their palms. A pastor prayed, a choir sang. Denise stood motionless, wrapped in a heavy coat, her face hollow with grief. Just before Christmas, she placed 2 wrapped gifts beneath the tree, a blue box for Amber, a pink one for Kayla. She couldn't bring herself to remove them. Upstairs, the girls' bedroom stayed exactly as they'd left them. Posters on the walls, laundry folded on chairs, a half-completed sketch on Amber's desk, a fantasy book open on Kayla's pillow. Time stopped there, completely. By January 2004, the Dalton case officially went cold. The file was placed into the department's archive cabinet, second shelf, left side, marked with a single piece of red tape. But Ellery never moved on from it. He kept a copy of the girl's photo in his desk drawer. He reread the file once a month. He carried the weight of the case in a way that made people stop asking how he was sleeping. Years passed. Maple Hollow healed on the surface. Stores changed hands. New families moved in. Kids grew up. A generation reached adulthood never knowing the full story of the 2 missing sisters. But the truth didn't fade. It waited. Buried. Quiet. Patient. And 22 years later, when a forgotten storage unit door rolled open in a dusty facility on the outskirts of Ash Hollow, that truth, finally, began to stir. It started as nothing more than a public auction, one of those quiet Saturday morning events where bargain hunters sift through dusty boxes hoping to find something worth reselling. Most storage units cleared out after delinquent payments hold nothing but failed garage sale leftovers. A broken lamp, a water-stained recliner, boxes labeled Christmas or baby clothes. But Unit 28 at Hillside Self-Storage outside Ash Hollow, Illinois, opened on a cool October morning in 2023, was different the moment the metal door rolled up. The air that spilled out smelled of insulation and old cardboard. The fluorescent hallway lights flickered as a man named Dale Cooper, a part-time reseller, stepped forward with a notepad tucked under one arm. He'd won the unit for just over $80, not expecting much. Inside, he saw organized rows of boxes, some neatly labeled in thick black marker, Household 2003. Others stacked loosely. A workbench, rusted tools, a rolled tarp, old tar cans. Nothing immediately valuable. Then, in the far corner, he noticed a collapsed blue duffel bag, the fabric stiff with age. He knelt beside it, half expecting baseball gear or maybe old uniforms. But when he unzipped it, what spilled out made his breath hitch. 2 cracked flip phones, the kind no one had used in nearly 2 decades. A cluster of clothing tags with the Ridgeway Mall logo partially visible, and a receipt, stuck to the lining with a dark, dried stain spreading across the corner. When Dale saw the date, June 14, 2003, he froze. He recognized the name of the store. Everyone who grew up within 30 miles of Maple Hollow knew the story of the Dalton sisters. His voice shook as he called the police. Within the hour, squad cars blocked off the entire row. Officers wrapped the unit in crime scene tape. The duffel bag was sealed in evidence containers and rushed to the state lab. Every box, every tarp, every scrap of paper was cataloged. Across the paperwork scattered on the workbench, one detail jumped out. The name on the lease was Roy Beckett. You could feel the mood shift instantly as the officers whispered among themselves. That name had lingered in old case files and late-night discussions for 20 years. At the time, it had been nothing more than suspicion without proof. Now it was a fuse waiting to burn. The updated report hit retired detective Mark Ellery the same evening. He was in his small home office sorting through old fishing gear when his phone rang. Quietly, he listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't breathe. When the call ended, Ellery sank into the nearest chair and held his head in both hands. He wasn't sure he should feel relief or rage. The one man he had never stopped circling back to had been tied directly to items that should have been buried in the Dalton sisters' timeline. The problem was, Beckett was already dead, gone since 2010. Whatever answers he had died with him. But the storage unit had not died. It had waited. The media descended within hours of the story breaking. Helicopters hovered over the storage facility. News vans lined the entrance. The headlines spread like wildfire through Illinois. Major break in 20-year-old Dalton sisters case. Detectives reopened the investigation immediately. Evidence from the unit was transferred to modern forensics labs far more advanced than those from 2003. DNA analysis, fiber comparison, chemical testing on the stained receipt, digital extraction from the old phones. Within days, small but devastating pieces of information began to surface. Both flip phones belonged to Amber and Kayla. Their service plans were canceled within days of their disappearance. One partial fingerprint on the mall store receipt belonged to Roy Beckett. That detail alone would have changed everything back in 2003. But 2 decades too late, it only confirmed what Ellery had always feared. The investigation had been pointed away from the truth. Still, the question remained. Why had Beckett kept this evidence at all? If he had been involved, why store incriminating items instead of destroying them? Why continue paying for a unit no one visited? Unless he was saving them as trophies, or as leverage, or out of fear. Detectives didn't know which theory fit, but they agreed on one thing. The truth lay deeper inside that storage unit. On the 3rd day, while technicians cleared the remaining boxes, someone found something strange. A plywood panel on the floor that didn't match the pattern of the others. It had been glued carefully to the concrete, but sounded hollow when tapped. Crowbars wedged under the edge. With effort, the panel peeled back. Beneath it lay a rusted metal toolbox, wrapped in layers of duct tape yellowed with age. The room went still when a technician cut the first strip. Inside were Polaroids, dozens of them, stacked between sheets of newspaper dated from the early 2000s. Time had curled their edges and washed out their colors, but what they showed was unmistakable. 2 terrified girls, sitting in a concrete-walled basement, alive, days after they vanished. Their eyes wide and glossy, their cheeks streaked with tears, a mattress behind them, tools scattered in the corners, a wooden beam bearing a faint manufacturing stencil. And in several photos, a partial view of what looked like exposed pipes and raw insulation, the kind found only in certain construction styles. Investigators identified it almost immediately. A rural farmhouse structure, the kind common on old Illinois properties built before the 1950s. A memory stirred in one of the senior detectives. A rumor about a property connected to Beckett's family, a place abandoned shortly after 2003. Records confirmed it within hours. A farmhouse on Old Bramble Road, 10 miles from Ridgeway Mall. Owned by a relative of Beckett. Left to rot shortly after the sisters vanished. When officers arrived the next morning, the building leaned to one side like it was bowing under the weight of everything it had seen. The windows were boarded, the roof sagging, the yard engulfed in thigh-high weeds. Inside the basement, they found it. The room from the Polaroids. Same beams, same crumbling concrete, same cold metal smell. A brittle mattress rotting in the corner. Rope fibers embedded in a post. And placed carefully on a rusted workbench as if someone had meant to return for them. 2 laminated school IDs. Amber Dalton. Kayla Dalton. The hope the town had clung to for 20 years finally collapsed. But the horror was only beginning.
because the evidence in that basement revealed something no one was prepared to face. Roy Beckett had not acted alone, and the second man had once been trusted with a badge.
News of the farmhouse discovery spread through Illinois like wildfire, igniting every rumor that had ever flickered in the dark corners of Maple Hollow. But investigators stayed locked in a different kind of storm, one built of evidence bags, DNA reports, and the gnawing realization that they were staring at a truth far worse than they'd imagined. Because inside that crumbling basement on Old Bramble Road, the forensic team found more than old rope fibers and an aging mattress. They found fingerprints, skin cells trapped in splintered wood, traces of blood embedded in the concrete. And when the lab results came back, they confirmed two profiles. One was Roy Beckett. The other was someone else. Someone who'd never been flagged before. Someone whose DNA wasn't in any criminal database. The lab director called Detective Ellery personally. The second sample belonged to a man who had once been sworn to protect the very girls whose case he helped bury. Deputy Carl Henson. Ellery felt the blood drain from his face. Henson had been one of the first officers on scene back in 2003, the man who was supposed to file the initial field report when the Dalton sisters' car was found at the abandoned gas station. But that report had never been submitted. At the time, no one saw it as suspicious. Paperwork got lost, officers got overwhelmed, cases moved fast. But now, 22 years later, those missing documents looked less like an oversight and more like an erasure. Investigators tore apart the early case files, combing through every dispatch log, every chain of custody sheet, every interview transcript. And slowly, inconsistencies began rising to the surface. Timestamps that didn't match. Witness statements altered or cut short. Evidence logged hours later than it should have been. Tips that never made it to the official file. The truth settled over the task force like a sickness. Henson hadn't stumbled into the case. He had maneuvered himself into it. And piece by piece, he'd redirected the investigation away from Beckett, away from the farmhouse, away from anything that might have led detectives to the basement on Old Bramble Road. Ellery felt like he had swallowed broken glass when he realized just how deep the betrayal ran. Henson hadn't just helped hide the girls. He had buried the path to the truth, one careful omission at a time. And worst of all, the man couldn't answer for any of it.
He died in a drunken single-vehicle crash in 2007. For investigators in 2023, that detail felt like a door slamming shut. Still, there were more questions than answers. They dug deeper into Henson's background. Before joining law enforcement, he'd worked part-time as a contractor, handling basement renovations, drywall, plumbing. Records showed dozens of jobs across southern Illinois, and several completed alongside Roy Beckett. One invoice from April 2003 made the room go silent. It showed Beckett and Henson had done renovation work on the same farmhouse later discovered in the Polaroids. The basement where Amber and Kayla had been kept alive. The one with the rope fibers. The one with the mattress. The one with their school IDs. The pieces clicked together like a slow-building nightmare. Beckett and Henson hadn't been acquaintances. They'd been partners, on job sites, on side work, and, as it now appeared, on something far darker. Investigators reconstructed what they believed happened that summer. On June 14, 2003, Beckett drove to Ridgeway Mall in his white cargo van. He'd worked maintenance there before. He knew the layout. He knew which exits weren't covered by cameras. He knew where teens tended to walk between stores.
He likely approached the Dalton sisters with some harmless-seeming request, directions, help carrying something, or a story about needing assistance with his vehicle. Whatever the lure, it worked. They got into his van. Detectives believe Beckett transported them to the farmhouse basement and restrained them. The Polaroids confirmed the girls were alive for at least a short time afterwards. Their expressions changed between photos, fear sharpening, hope draining. But the evidence suggested Beckett soon panicked. Once Amber's voicemail began circulating in the media, once their disappearance became headlines, Beckett turned to the only person he trusted, the one person who could shield him from the investigation, Deputy Carl Henson. A lawman with access to the case. A badge, the authority to redirect suspicion, and the training to do it without leaving fingerprints, until he did. Henson likely advised Beckett on what evidence to remove, which alibi to construct. He personally visited Mary Collins, Beckett's supposed client, and pressured her into confirming Beckett's whereabouts. She admitted years later she thought she was helping correct a clerical mistake. But Henson hadn't been fixing paperwork. He had been controlling the entire investigation. For weeks, the two men managed to keep the truth buried. But silence has a way of rotting from the inside. Beckett, already unstable, began drinking more, talking more, losing control. Investigators now believe Henson realized Beckett was becoming a liability. And in 2007, when Henson died in a crash that was quickly ruled an accident, whispers surfaced that Beckett had confided things to the wrong people. But back then, with no evidence, those whispers dissolved into the cold Illinois air. It would take the discovery of the storage unit to resurrect them. Detectives now understood the dynamic. Beckett, the predator; Henson, the protector turned accomplice. A criminal partnership bound by guilt and secrets. But one question still lingered. Why keep the photographs? Why store the Dalton sisters' phones, their tags, their receipt, instead of destroying them? Some investigators believed Beckett saved them as trophies. Others thought Henson kept them as insurance, proof he could use if Beckett ever turned on him. But Ellery believed something different, something darker. He believed the photographs existed because Beckett was afraid. Not afraid of arrest, not afraid of confession. Afraid of Henson. Afraid of the man who wore a badge by day and hid a monster shadow at night. And those Polaroids, those terrible, fragile snapshots of fear, may have been Beckett's only way of protecting himself if things ever went wrong. But the truth wasn't finished unraveling. Because during the second sweep of the storage unit, an officer pulled away another warped layer of insulation along the back wall. Behind it was something small, something metallic, something taped shut. And inside that object was the final secret Beckett had taken to the grave. A secret that would forever rewrite the final hours of Amber and Kayla Dalton. The object pulled from the back wall of the storage unit looked insignificant at first, just a small metal case wrapped tightly in aged duct tape, the kind of container people use for screws or nails. But when the technician held it up to the light, the room's noise faded, because everyone knew by then nothing inside Beckett's locker was ordinary. Detectives sealed the case in an evidence bag, carried it to a cleared table, and began cutting the tape layer by layer. The metal creaked under pressure, a hinge snapped, and when the lid finally lifted, the breath left the room. Inside lay items so personal, so final, that even veteran investigators paused. There were 2 silver earrings, mismatched but unmistakably belonging to teenage girls, a tiny charm bracelet, a torn corner of a photograph, and beneath those, a folded piece of newspaper dated June 16, 2003, 2 days after Amber and Kayla Dalton vanished. Wrapped inside that newspaper were 3 things: a strand of hair, a narrow strip of fabric, and a small, handwritten note, just 2 words: "Not alone."
The handwriting didn't match Beckett's employment records. It didn't match his signed statements from years earlier, but investigators recognized it instantly. It was Carl Henson's handwriting. Confirming it felt like someone had opened a door that had been locked for 20 years, and behind it was a room filled with lies. With the metal case processed, detectives moved quickly to reconstruct the final days of the Dalton sisters. They didn't argue in the conference room. For once, no one spoke over another. The air was too heavy, the stakes too real. The timeline grew sharper. June 14, Beckett abducts the girls from the mall, drives them to the farmhouse basement. Amber manages to leave a voicemail, cut short. June 15, the girls are still alive. The Polaroids confirm it. June 16, Henson intervenes. Something shifts. Investigators now believed Henson went to the farmhouse after news reports intensified. Maybe Beckett called him in panic. Maybe Henson trekked in on his own. But whatever happened, the metal case, the hair, the torn fabric, and the note told a story.
Henson wanted Beckett to know they were in it together. That phrase, "not alone," was more than reassurance. It was leverage, a reminder, a threat. Beckett and Henson were bound to the same terrible secret, and Henson wanted Beckett to understand that if one of them fell, the other would go with him. For Ellery, that discovery felt like a blade to the gut. For years, he'd believed Beckett acted alone. He'd tormented himself, replaying every missed clue. But now, standing in the task force room, the truth darkened everything. A fellow officer had manipulated the entire investigation from the inside. It made sense of details that had never sat right. Henson arriving early at the car scene. Henson filing no initial report. Henson steering interviews. Henson confirming Beckett's alibi through Mary Collins. Henson logging items late or not at all. He hadn't just helped Beckett. He'd orchestrated the cover-up. But the most devastating revelation wasn't in the paperwork. It was what investigators found at the farmhouse's collapsed well a week later. Using ground-penetrating radar, the team identified anomalies in the soil behind the house, disturbed earth, debris, fragments. Days of careful excavation followed, and when the forensic anthropologists brushed away the dirt with steady hands and unsteady breath, they found human remains. Small, fragile, buried less than 6 feet deep. Testing later confirmed what everyone feared. The remains belonged to Amber and Kayla. The news shattered whatever hope had been left in Maple Hollow. What the town had prayed wasn't true became undeniable. But the farmhouse and the storage unit still had more to say. Investigators found fibers matching the Dalton sisters' jackets inside the well, a bracelet belonging to Amber, a shoe missing its laces soaked in soil, a fragment of Kayla's favorite book, waterlogged and nearly unreadable but still recognizable from the stylized lettering across the corner. And then something else. Something that rewrote the order of events. The medical examiner found evidence suggesting the girls did not die the day they vanished, nor the day after. They had been alive for several days, long enough that the window for saving them had existed if anyone had known where to look, long enough that Henson's manipulation of the case had cost them far more than dignity or justice. It had cost them time. Ellery sat alone in his car after reviewing the findings, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. 20 years of guilt soaked through him. All those nights staring at the case file, all those hours wondering where he'd failed. He'd never imagined the real failure belonged to someone wearing the same uniform. While the public reeled, the investigation tightened around Henson's role. His locker at the sheriff's office, long unopened since his death, still sat in the basement storage room. When detectives pried it open, they found notebooks filled with what looked like mundane work entries, but sliding under those were scraps of paper with cryptic words. Check storage. Renew lease. Don't forget June. Basement. Lock. B. Nervous. B. Beckett. The notebooks confirmed what investigators now believed. After Beckett abducted the sisters, he panicked. He turned to Henson, and Henson
seeing an opportunity to manipulate the situation, took control. He didn't just help Beckett hide the evidence, he orchestrated the entire cover-up. He visited the farmhouse, handled the Polaroids, arranged the storage unit lease in late 2003, renewed confirmations afterwards until his death in 2007. After that, automated payments from a shared account kept the unit sealed for years. Not because the two men wanted to preserve their secret, but because no one living remembered the account existed. And so the evidence waited, and the truth slept for 15 years, until a storage auction finally forced the lock open. Detectives briefed Ellery with every new development, though he was technically retired. He attended every meeting, his posture stiff, eyes rimmed red, voice gravel-thin. Watching the truth unravel visibly aged him. For 20 years, he'd believed Ellery failed Amber and Kayla. Now he knew the truth. Henson had failed them. The system had failed them. But Ellery was the only one still looking. The case, for the first time in 20 years, had a complete narrative. Except for one final question. Why in all that time had no one noticed the storage unit? Why had no family member come forward? No sheriff's deputy? No relative of Beckett's? Investigators thought they had every piece. But they didn't. Not yet. Because one final item, overlooked during the first searches, wedged deep behind insulation, remained hidden in the shadows of the unit. And when discovered, it would reveal the last heartbreaking detail of the Dalton sisters' story.
The discovery of the farmhouse remains should have been the end. The case had answers now. Horrifying, heartbreaking answers, but answers all the same. Yet investigators couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something missing, something that would explain the oddest part of the entire timeline. Why had Beckett kept everything? Why store the phones, the tags, the Polaroids, the note, the scraps of clothing? Why keep paying for a locker no one visited? Even if automatic payments covered it, someone originally chose that unit. Someone placed those items there with purpose. And why hide a metal case twice, then bury more behind insulation? There was intention behind the chaos. On the 7th day of processing the storage unit, a young crime scene technician named Marissa knelt beside the back wall, scraping away remaining strips of insulation. She had been assigned to check areas already cleared, a task most techs dreaded. Slow, tedious work with microscopic odds of finding something meaningful. But this time, something caught her eye. A sliver of metal, barely visible under compressed insulation. Not rusted, not old, shiny. Too shiny to have been there for 20 years without protection. She called her supervisor. Within minutes, the entire team crowded around the wall. What they tugged free wasn't a box. It wasn't a container. Not even a case. It was a key. A single, small, brass key with a plastic tag attached, the writing faded almost beyond recognition. The tag had once been white, now yellowed. On its surface, written in faint blue ink, were 2 letters, A.D. For a long moment, no one spoke. When the key was sealed in evidence and transported to the lab, technicians used ultraviolet light to read the rest of the faded writing. The letters AD were the only part still legible, but under magnification, a second set of initials appeared, just barely visible. KD. Amber Dalton, Kayla Dalton. The key belonged to one of them, maybe both. But it didn't match the Dalton family home. It didn't match Amber's car key. It didn't match her locker at school or Kayla's. It didn't fit any lock found in the farmhouse. So investigators searched their case logs again. And that's when Detective Ellery, quiet as a held breath, remembered something.
In the early days of the original investigation, Denise Dalton had mentioned that her daughters shared a small keepsake box, something they called their sister safe, a place they stored notes, ticket stubs, friendship bracelets, small secrets meant only for the two of them. Ellery had never found it, and over the years the detail had faded from memory.
But now, after seeing the initials, it came roaring back. If the key belonged to their sister safe, that meant something terrible. Beckett or Henson had taken it from the girls while they were still alive. And if the key ended up inside the storage unit, stuffed behind insulation, someone had wanted to hide it more carefully than everything else. That begged the question, what did the sister safe contain, and where was it now? Investigators returned to the Dalton home, now vacant since Denise's passing, to look again, this time with fresh eyes and new suspicion. They spent hours moving slowly through the rooms. Kayla's bedroom was exactly as Denise had preserved it before her death, walls lined with taped-up fantasy posters, a stack of books leaning precariously beside the bed, a small desk covered with the scratches of teenage handwriting. They searched drawers, under the bed, behind the dresser, inside the closet. Nothing. Amber's room told a similar story. Sketchbooks on the desk, art supplies still scattered the way she used them. No lockbox, no sister safe. But as investigators were preparing to leave, Ellery stopped in the hallway. He stared at the floorboards, aged, slightly warped, original to the house. He crouched, ran his hand along a seam, and there it was, a faint square outline, barely visible. He called for a flashlight, angled it just right, and the gap between boards shimmered. The sister safe hadn't been missing. It had been hidden by the girls themselves. Under a loose section of floor, it took careful work to pry it open without damaging evidence. The small wooden safe lifted out of the floor like something exhumed from a grave. The lock had been broken long ago, forced open, likely by Beckett or Henson. Inside were letters. Tiny folded notes passed between sisters, a friendship bracelet, a concert wristband, a faded mall photo strip of Amber and Kayla making silly faces. But beneath these were items investigators didn't expect. There were 2 torn corners of paper, matching the style of the newspaper Beckett had used to wrap the metal case, likely stuffed back in the box by him or by Henson. They didn't mean much alone. But then came the part no one saw coming. Under the letters lay a partially torn sheet of notebook paper, written in trembling handwriting. "Mom, if we don't come home, look in the van, behind the mat. We didn't want to get in. We tried. We tried." The handwriting was Kayla's. The words were dated June 14th, 2003, the same day they vanished. Investigators froze. Ellery sat down on the edge of Kayla's bed, unable to catch his breath. His hands shook as he read the note again. The girls had tried to escape. They'd tried to leave a message, a warning, evidence, but it had never been found, because the van Beckett used wasn't discovered near the gas station. It had been moved, and Henson controlling evidence collection had ensured no one took it apart thoroughly. If someone had looked behind the mat in 2003, if someone had found Kayla's message, everything would have changed. Amber and Kayla might have been found alive. The note confirmed their final moments were filled with fear, courage, and a desperate attempt to save themselves. And it confirmed the full depth of the betrayal. Not a mistake, not a failure, a cover-up. Deliberate, cruel, complete. The sister safe note was the last missing piece. The one thing Beckett and Henson had somehow overlooked. After investigators finished cataloging the items, Ellery was the last one to leave the house. He paused in the entryway and looked back at the quiet rooms filled with ghosts. For the first time in years, he felt both sorrow and certainty. They finally knew what the Dalton sisters had been trying to say, and now, finally, their voices would be heard.
By the time spring sunlight rolled across Illinois in early 2025, the Dalton sisters' case, once a quiet heartbreak locked inside Mabel Hollow's memory, had become a statewide headline. News vans lined the courthouse steps, reporters paced outside police stations,
Every broadcast opened with the same stark phrase: "After 22 years, the Dalton sisters have been found." The announcement came on a gray weekday morning, the kind that feels suspended between seasons. Inside the Maple Hollow courthouse, state officials, detectives, forensic analysts, and retired officers stood shoulder to shoulder as the district attorney stepped up to the wooden podium. Her voice was steady when she said it. The remains recovered from the old Bramble Road farmhouse site have been positively identified as Amber and Kayla Dalton. Silence washed over the room. Not the silence of shock. Maple Hollow had braced for this. But the silence that follows truth. Heavy. Final. The forensic report confirmed the details no one wanted to hear. The girls died within days of being taken. They fought. They suffered. They were not alone in those final hours, and they were never given a chance to come home. For Ellery, standing near the back of the room with his hands clasped in front of him, that knowledge felt like lead in his chest. The district attorney continued, outlining the evidence that finally broke the case open. The storage unit, the duffel bag, the Polaroids, the DNA match to Henson, the timelines reconstructed by modern analysis, and the sister safe note recovered from the Dalton home. She spoke plainly, without dramatics, because the facts were already enough. Cameras clicked. Pens moved. The truth unfolded. Then, a man in his mid-30s approached the podium. Ryan Dalton, the girl's younger brother. He'd been 13 the summer his sisters vanished. His voice trembled as he unfolded a worn sheet of notebook paper. "For 22 years," he began, "our family lived with a question that didn't have an answer." His voice cracked, but he pushed through it. "My mom died believing her girls might walk through the door one day. She hoped every minute of her life. And now," his breath caught, "we finally know. They weren't lost. They weren't wandering. They were taken." He paused, gripping the sides of the podium. "But today, they're not missing anymore. They're home." People in the room wiped tears from their cheeks. Officers, reporters, strangers who had searched cornfields 20 years earlier. The courthouse flag fluttered at half-staff outside the window, its shadow trembling across the room. Later that afternoon, after the press dispersed and the courthouse steps emptied, Ellery drove alone to the hillside self-storage facility. He had requested one final walkthrough before the unit was permanently sealed and transferred to the state archive. The clerk recognized him instantly and nodded with quiet respect. The metal door slid open. Unit 28 yawned into view, empty now. Bare concrete, strips of old tape clinging to the walls. The stale, metallic smell lingered, the scent of a secret kept too long. Ellery stepped inside. His footsteps echoed. In his hand was a small plastic evidence bag, the last item found in the unit after the forensic teams had packed up. A silver heart locket, the chain tangled and rusted. It had been wedged behind a support beam, as if it had slipped through fingers or been thrown aside in haste. The front of the locket was scratched, but when Ellery gently pried it open, the hinge held. Inside were two minuscule photographs, yellowed but unmistakable. Amber and Kayla, arms wrapped around each other, smiling so wide you could feel the joy leap off the paper.
The kind of picture only sisters take. The kind of picture no one knew existed. Ellery felt a hollow ache bloom beneath his ribs. He pressed the locket into his palm until the metal edge left an imprint. 22 years of paperwork, sleepless nights, false leads, and quiet grief had brought him to this room. A small, forgotten storage unit holding the final echoes of two girls whose lives were violently redirected. He whispered, almost to himself, "We found you." He sealed the locket back inside its evidence bag and labeled it carefully. Returned to family. Case closed, 2025. Then he switched off the light and stepped out into the hallway. The door rolled down behind him with a final metallic groan, sealing away an era of secrets. In the weeks that followed, the Dalton sisters were laid to rest beside their mother in a quiet cemetery bordered by oak trees on the edge of Maple Hollow. A new headstone was placed between theirs and Denise's. It read, "Together again, finally home." People from every corner of town came to pay their respects. Old classmates, former teachers, neighbors, search volunteers who had combed fields back in 2003. Some left flowers, others left notes. A few left small trinkets, tokens of memory, of guilt, of hope. The case became a required reading at law enforcement seminars. Not because of the brutality of the crime, though it was brutal. Not because of the cold case mechanics, though they were complex. But because of the betrayal. A lawman hiding behind a badge. Paperwork quietly altered. Evidence redirected. A community misled by someone sworn to protect it. It became a lesson many officers vowed never to forget. Detective Ellery officially retired again after the case closed. But people who knew him said he aged differently in those final months. Not lighter, not exactly at peace, but no longer carrying the frantic tension that had defined him for decades. He kept the Dalton sisters' photo in his wallet, always. Sometimes neighbors saw him sitting on his front porch in the evenings, watching the sun disappear behind the tree line. If someone asked about Amber and Kayla, he'd nod slowly and say just 3 words. They made it. Not back alive, not back the way Maple Hollow prayed for, but back to the truth, back to their family, back to the place where their story could finally rest. In the end, the Dalton sisters' disappearance was not a mystery about 2 girls who wandered away or ran off with friends. It was a story about 2 young women caught in the path of a predator and his protector, a handyman and the deputy who shielded him. A story of evidence buried in dirt, hidden behind false walls, taped inside forgotten boxes, lying silent in a locker no one thought to open. A story of betrayal, yes, but also one of perseverance. Of a mother who never gave up, of a brother who carried hope through adulthood, of a detective who refused to let their names fade. 22 years after 2 sisters drove to the mall on an ordinary summer afternoon, the truth finally emerged from the dark. Amber and Kayla Dalton were found, heard, returned, finally home.